Let me see y'all. No lashes, no makeup, no lip gloss, no filter, no none. The wig. Okay.
Shit, what a not.
Why not? Minus Will.
Minus Will.
On January 9th, 2026, at approximately 9:20 a.m., Chicago police responded to a 911 call on the 7100 block of South Ridgeland Avenue in the South Shore neighborhood and found 26-year-old Edshania Williams with a single gunshot wound to the head. The circumstances surrounding her death were unclear at the time, and initial reports did not indicate a motive. Hours later, officers located and arrested 23-year-old Trevally Smith in the 1300 block of East 60th Street. He was charged with first-degree murder and unlawful weapon possession in connection with the shooting. Investigators noted that Smith and Williams were siblings, but police had not released details explaining what led to the fatal encounter. The initial crime scene witness accounts and subsequent police actions offer only fragments of a story that demands full scrutiny as the case unfolds. Stay with us as we unravel this shocking story and uncover the heartbreaking details of what led to this senseless loss. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what are your thoughts as the story unfolds? Welcome to True Crime Tales, where we reveal the crimes that shock communities and the secrets hidden behind closed doors. These are real people, real events, real consequences. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's begin. Edshania Williams was a 26-year-old woman residing in Chicago at the time of her death. She lived within the city limits and maintained regular contact with her immediate family members. Her gender, age, and residence placed her within a demographic frequently examined in urban homicide investigations, particularly those involving domestic or family-related violence. Edshania was part of a small family unit that included siblings and close relatives. Among those siblings was her younger brother, Trevally Smith, who would later become the primary suspect in her death. Their relationship, while not publicly detailed prior to the incident, placed them in close proximity through shared family ties. Available information indicates that family members interacted regularly, though the nature of those interactions varied over time. The family structure did not indicate estrangement or long-term separation between siblings. There was no immediate indication of court-ordered separation or documented family exclusion prior to the incident. However, investigators later began examining whether unresolved family conflicts existed beneath the surface. Edshania Williams maintained a routine consistent with an adult living independently or semi-independently in a metropolitan area. Her employment status has not been fully disclosed, but records suggest she was engaged in regular daily activity outside the home. Her education history indicated completion of standard schooling, with no publicly available evidence of ongoing enrollment in higher education at the time. Her daily habits included maintaining contact with friends and family, managing personal responsibilities, and engaging in online activity. There were no confirmed reports of substance abuse or criminal involvement tied to her name. Investigators did not initially identify her as being involved in any known disputes outside her immediate social environment. Edshania's social circle consisted of close friends, acquaintances, and family members. She was known to maintain a small but consistent group of associates rather than a wide public presence. There were no confirmed reports of active romantic relationships at the time of her death, though investigators reviewed personal communications to determine whether interpersonal tensions existed. No formal restraining orders or legal disputes tied to romantic partners were documented prior to the shooting. However, investigators did not rule out informal disagreements or private conflicts that may not have been reported to authorities. Edshania maintained an active digital presence typical of individuals in her age group. Her social media accounts showed regular activity, including posts, interactions, and messaging with known contacts. In the days leading up to the incident, her online behavior did not initially suggest imminent danger. Investigators reviewed recent posts and private messages to identify any changes in tone, content, or frequency. There were no confirmed threats or distress signals publicly visible. However, law enforcement examined private communications for possible arguments, disagreements, or references to family tension. No abrupt deletion of content or sudden behavioral shifts were publicly documented, though investigators continued analyzing archive data to establish a timeline. On the day before the shooting, Edshania was reported to have followed her normal routine. She interacted with individuals within her social circle and remained within the Chicago area. No travel outside the city was reported. Investigators later sought to determine whether she had contact with her brother, Travali Smith, in the hours leading up to the incident. Any conversations, visits, or disputes occurring during that time frame became central to the investigation. No public reports confirmed a heated argument immediately before the shooting, though law enforcement treated this as an open line of inquiry. The relationship between Edshania and her brother was defined by familial proximity. They were siblings who maintained contact, though the depth and quality of their relationship varied over time. Investigators examined whether long-standing tensions, disagreements, or financial issues existed between them. There was no initial indication of a public feud or long-term estrangement. However, police reviewed past interactions to identify patterns of instability, conflict escalation, or dependency. At the time of the incident, Edshania resided at the South Ridgeland Avenue location. It was unclear whether her brother lived at the residence permanently, temporarily, or was visiting at the time. Determining living arrangements became a critical component of the investigation, as shared spaces often complicate domestic homicide cases. Investigators examined lease agreements, mail records, and witness statements to establish who had access to the residence and under what circumstances. Law enforcement explored the possibility of financial disagreements, including shared expenses, debts, or disputes involving money or property. While no confirmed financial motive was immediately identified, investigators did not exclude the possibility of an argument escalating from a personal or economic disagreement. Authorities reviewed police records for prior domestic disturbances involving the family. This included calls for service, wellness checks, or noise complaints linked to the residents or family members. No publicly confirmed protective orders or documented restraining orders existed at the time. However, the absence of formal records did not eliminate the possibility of undocumented disputes. Neighbors and individuals familiar with the family were interviewed. Some reported regular activity at the residence, while others noted occasional loud conversations or disagreements, though none initially reported physical violence. Witnesses were asked to describe interactions between Edshania and her brother, including tone, frequency, and any signs of instability. The incident occurred inside a residential property located on the 7100 block of South Ridgeland Avenue. The structure was a standard urban dwelling with multiple rooms. Investigators focused on a specific room where Edshania was found. Edshania was located inside the residence with a single gunshot wound to the head. Her position was documented as part of standard forensic procedure. Blood evidence was visible at the scene, consistent with the injury sustained. There were no immediate signs of forced entry, suggesting that the shooter may have been known to the victim or had authorized access to the residence. A firearm was associated with the incident. Investigators determined whether the weapon was found at the scene or recovered later. The condition of the weapon, including whether it had been recently fired, was documented. Evidence collected included shell casings, ballistic material, and trace evidence. Fingerprints and DNA samples were obtained from relevant surfaces and objects within the room. The scene was processed by forensic teams who documented evidence through photographs and forensic mapping. Each item was logged, collected, and preserved for laboratory analysis. A 911 call was placed reporting the shooting. Investigators documented the time of the call, the identity of the caller, and the statements made during the call. First responders arrived and conducted a medical assessment. Edshania Williams was pronounced deceased at the scene. Police secured the area, restricted access, and separated potential witnesses to prevent cross-contamination of statements. Detectives conducted preliminary questioning and began identifying potential suspects. Early indicators directed attention toward an individual known to the victim, leading to the identification of Travali Smith as a suspect. In the hours following the discovery of Edshania Williams' body, investigators moved quickly to identify individuals who had recent contact with her. Early interviews, combined with information gathered at the crime scene, led detectives to focus on Travali Smith, a 23-year-old male identified as the victim's brother. The familial relationship immediately placed Smith within the scope of the investigation, as evidence suggested he had been present at or near the residence around the time of the shooting. Police reconstructed a preliminary timeline using emergency call records, witness statements, and electronic data. Edshania Williams was pronounced deceased shortly after officers arrived at the South Ridgeland Avenue residence. Within hours of that discovery, detectives tracked Smith's movements through location data, eyewitness information, and surveillance footage from nearby streets. This timeline showed a narrow window between the reported shooting and Smith's departure from the area. Several hours after the homicide was confirmed, officers located Smith on the 1300 block of East 60th Street. Law enforcement units approached the location cautiously, treating the situation as a high-risk arrest due to the suspected involvement of a firearm. Smith was taken into custody without reported resistance. Officers conducted a search incident to arrest and documented items in his possession at the time. These items were secured as potential evidence and logged for further forensic examination. Following his arrest, Smith was formally charged with first-degree murder and unlawful possession of a weapon. The charges reflected the seriousness of the allegations and were based on preliminary evidence indicating intentional conduct and illegal firearm involvement. Investigators next turned their attention to establishing a comprehensive background profile of Trevally Smith. This process involved reviewing public records, interviewing associates, and analyzing prior interactions with law enforcement. Smith's personal history included details about his education and employment status, which were assessed to establish routine patterns and stability. Records indicated inconsistent employment and periods of unemployment. His living situation was also examined, including whether he resided alone with family or moved between locations. Investigators noted that Smith did not maintain a stable, long-term residence at the time of the incident. A review of Smith's criminal history revealed prior interactions with law enforcement. While not all encounters resulted in convictions, records showed previous arrests and documented incidents that placed him on police radar. Of particular interest were known firearm-related violations, which supported the unlawful possession charge filed after his arrest. These prior incidents were evaluated to determine whether they demonstrated a pattern relevant to the current case. Behavioral analysis formed another critical component of the background investigation. Detectives reviewed reports of past confrontations, including any documented violent behavior. Interviews with individuals familiar with Smith suggested a history of volatility, particularly during disputes. Investigators also explored potential substance use, examining whether alcohol or drugs had played a role in previous incidents or might have influenced Smith's behavior on the day of the shooting. Mental health considerations were reviewed carefully. Law enforcement sought information on any prior psychological evaluations, hospitalizations, or treatment records that could provide context for Smith's actions. Statements from acquaintances referencing erratic behavior or instability were documented but treated cautiously, pending professional evaluation. While no formal diagnosis was immediately disclosed, these factors were included in the broader investigative framework. After his arrest, Smith was transported to a police facility for questioning. The interrogation process followed standard procedural guidelines. Smith was informed of his rights and provided the opportunity to request legal representation. The duration of the interview, the conditions under which it took place, and the presence or absence of an attorney were all documented to ensure procedural compliance. During questioning, Smith provided statements regarding his whereabouts and actions surrounding the time of the shooting. Initial responses included denials of responsibility and explanations that placed him away from the scene. As the interview progressed, detectives noted changes in his account. Certain details shifted, including timelines and descriptions of interactions with the victim earlier that day. Investigators identified inconsistencies between Smith's statements and the evidence collected. Conflicting timelines emerged when his account was compared against surveillance footage, phone location data, and witness statements. In some instances, Smith's descriptions contradicted physical evidence recovered from the crime scene. Law enforcement conducted a credibility assessment based on these discrepancies. Detectives evaluated whether the inconsistencies resulted from confusion, intentional deception, or attempts to minimize involvement. These assessments played a role in reinforcing the decision to pursue first-degree murder charges. The statements made during interrogation, along with their contradictions, became a central component of the prosecution's case theory. Parallel to the investigative interviews, forensic and medical examinations were conducted to establish the cause and circumstances of Edshania Williams' death. An autopsy confirmed that the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. The medical examiner documented the trajectory of the bullet, which provided insight into the positioning of the shooter and the victim at the time the shot was fired. Time of death estimates were established using physiological indicators and were cross-referenced with emergency call logs and witness observations. These estimates align closely with the timeline investigators had already constructed, reinforcing the sequence of events leading up to the discovery of the body. Ballistics analysis focused on determining whether the firearm recovered or linked to Smith matched the bullet and shell casings found at the scene. Forensic experts examined caliber, rifling patterns, and ballistic markings to confirm weapon consistency. Distance analysis was also conducted to determine how far the shooter was from the victim when the firearm was discharged, providing additional context for intent and circumstance. Toxicology reports were prepared for both the victim and the suspect. These reports assessed the presence of alcohol, prescription medications, or illicit substances. The findings were used to evaluate whether impairment may have influenced actions or reactions during the incident. Toxicology results were incorporated into broader evidentiary record and reviewed by both investigators and prosecutors. The identification, arrest, and charging of Travali Smith marked a critical phase in the case. Each element, background analysis, interrogation outcomes, and forensic findings, contribute to a structured narrative constructed by law enforcement. The investigation relied on corroboration across multiple forms of evidence, rather than a single source, to support the charges filed. As the case moved forward, these findings formed the foundation for further legal proceedings, including pretrial hearings and potential trial testimony. While additional evidence and expert analysis were still pending, the framework established during this phase defined the direction of the prosecution and shaped the questions that would be examined in court. Determining the motive in the death of Edshania Williams remains one of the most complex aspects of the investigation. Law enforcement has not publicly confirmed a definitive motive, leaving multiple theories under examination. Investigators have approached the case by evaluating domestic conflict indicators, claims of accidental discharge, evidence pointing toward intent, and the possibility of alternative explanations. One of the primary investigative angles centers on the possibility of a domestic conflict between Edshania Williams and her brother, Travali Smith. Familial relationships can involve unresolved tensions that escalate over time, particularly when compounded by shared living spaces, financial pressures, or personal disagreements. Investigators examine whether the siblings had a history of arguments or disputes that could have contributed to a volatile encounter on the day of the shooting. This theory required detectives to review prior interactions, including any documented domestic incidents, verbal disputes witnessed by others, or communications suggesting strain. Law enforcement also evaluated whether there had been recent disagreements that could explain a rapid escalation. However, no publicly released records have confirmed prior police involvement between the siblings, leaving this theory partially supported but not fully substantiated. Closely related to the domestic conflict theory is the possibility that a verbal argument escalated into violence. Investigators consider whether a disagreement occurred shortly before the gunshot was fired. This includes analyzing witness statements, the timing of the incident, and any physical evidence suggesting a confrontation, such as overturned items, damaged property, or defensive injuries. An escalation scenario would require evidence that emotions or tensions intensified quickly, leading to the introduction of a firearm into the interaction. Detectives examine whether the firearm was already present, retrieved during an argument, or introduced unexpectedly. While escalation remains a plausible explanation, the absence of clear witness accounts has limited definitive conclusions. Investigators also assess whether long-standing unresolved disputes existed between the victim and the suspect. These could include financial disagreements over living arrangements, or conflict involving other family members. Such disputes may not always be documented, but can influence behavior over time. To explore this angle, law enforcement reviewed communications, including phone records and digital messages, to identify patterns of conflict. They also interviewed individuals familiar with the family dynamic, While unresolved disputes can establish context, investigators have not publicly identified a specific issue that directly precipitated the shooting. Another line of inquiry involved the possibility that the shooting was accidental. Accidental discharge claims often arise when a firearm is handled improperly or during a physical struggle. Investigators examine whether the firearm could have discharged unintentionally based on its mechanical condition and the manner in which it was handled. This theory required a detailed forensic analysis, including trigger sensitivity, safety mechanisms, and ballistic trajectory. Detectives also considered whether the positioning of the victim and the angle of the wound were consistent with an accidental discharge. While the defense may argue this theory, accidental shootings typically present distinct forensic patterns that must align with the physical evidence. Forensic findings play a critical role in evaluating accidental shooting claims. Investigators examine gunshot residue, distance of the shot, and the path of the bullet. A close-range shot, combined with specific trajectory indicators, can either support or contradict an accidental scenario. In this case, law enforcement focused on whether the evidence demonstrated deliberate aiming or uncontrolled discharge. Any inconsistencies between the suspect's statements and forensic findings were noted as significant. The determination of accident versus intent remains a central issue in the case. The intentional act theory suggests that the shooting was deliberate. This theory relies on evidence indicating purposeful behavior before, during, and after the incident. Investigators evaluated whether the suspect's actions demonstrated awareness and control, including handling of the weapon and conduct immediately following the shooting. Intent is often inferred through circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof. Detectives assess whether there were actions suggesting preparation, such as retrieving a firearm during a dispute or making statements indicating hostility. Behavioral indicators are often used to assess intent. Investigators reviewed the suspect's demeanor, consistency of statements, and response to questioning. Sudden changes in narrative, evasive answers, or attempts to minimize involvement can influence investigative conclusions. Law enforcement also examined behavior following the shooting, including whether the suspect attempted to leave the scene, contact others, or conceal evidence. These actions can be interpreted as indicative of intent, depending on the circumstances. Physical and digital evidence can suggest intent when viewed collectively. This includes ballistic evidence, firearm handling, and any communications preceding the incident. Investigators assess whether the shooting occurred at a distance or angle consistent with deliberate aiming. Any evidence indicating a conscious decision to use lethal force would weigh heavily toward an intentional act theory. The prosecution's case is expected to emphasize these elements. Investigators also considered alternative explanations beyond direct conflict between the siblings. These include the possibility of a third-party presence or involvement. While no additional suspects have been publicly identified, detectives evaluated whether another individual could have been present or influence events. The third-party theory examines whether someone else may have contributed to the incident, either directly or indirectly. This includes analyzing entry and exit points, surveillance footage, and phone location data. At present, law enforcement has not indicated evidence supporting third-party involvement, but the theory remains part of due diligence. As with many homicide investigations, questions remain regarding whether all potential leads have been fully examined. Investigators continue to assess whether additional witnesses, digital records, or forensic results could provide clarity. Following the arrest of Travali Smith, formal charges were filed, and the case entered the judicial process. The arraignment marked the suspect's first official court appearance, during which charges were read and rights were explained. During the court appearance, the defendant was informed of the charges and the potential penalties. The court reviewed preliminary information provided by prosecutors to establish probable cause. The judge considered factors such as the severity of the charges, the defendant's criminal history, and perceived flight risk when determining bail. Given the nature of the allegations, bail decisions were made with public safety considerations in mind. The prosecution strategy centers on establishing intent and disproving alternative explanations. Prosecutors are expected to emphasize forensic evidence, ballistic analysis, and the timeline of events. Key evidence includes firearm analysis, autopsy findings, and any statements made by the defendant. Prosecutors may also rely on digital records and expert testimony. Potential witnesses include responding officers, forensic experts, and individuals familiar with the relationship between the victim and the defendant. The defense is expected to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of events. This may involve arguing accidental discharge, lack of intent, or insufficient evidence. Possible defenses include accidental shooting, self-defense claims, or challenges to the credibility of evidence. The defense may question the handling and collection of evidence, as well as the reliability of forensic conclusions. Pretrial motions are likely to address admissibility of evidence and procedural issues. The defense may seek to suppress certain evidence if constitutional violations are alleged. The court may order evaluations to determine the defendant's competency to stand trial, depending on motions filed. Early media reports focus on basic facts, including the identities involved and the charges filed. Initial reporting relied heavily on police statements and court records, with limited contextual information. As the case progressed, media outlets provided updates on court proceedings and investigative developments. Each new filing or hearing influenced public understanding of the case. Public discussion emerged both locally and online, often centered on family violence and gun access. Community responses included calls for accountability and broader discussions on violence prevention. Social media platforms hosted speculation, some of which conflicted with verified information. Media framing influenced how the case was perceived, particularly regarding motive and intent. The combination of official updates and public commentary shaped broader perceptions of the case as it moved through the legal system. The South Shore neighborhood of Chicago has experienced sustained levels of gun violence over multiple years, consistent with broader trends observed across several parts of the city. Incidents involving firearms occur across residential streets, apartment complexes, and shared living spaces, often intersecting with domestic or interpersonal disputes. Law enforcement data has shown that many shootings in the area do not involve random targets, but arise from known relationships, disputes, or escalating conflicts within confined environments. These patterns complicate investigations, as the proximity between victims and suspects often blurs the line between spontaneous violence and premeditated acts. Shootings in the South Shore area occur with enough regularity to strain investigative and emergency response resources. While not all incidents result in fatalities, the frequency of gun-related calls has influenced how police deploy patrols and prioritize response times. Fatal shootings, particularly those occurring indoors, are less common than street-level incidents, but present greater investigative challenges due to limited witnesses and reliance on forensic evidence. In many cases, the presence of firearm within a residence significantly increases the likelihood that a domestic conflict will result in serious injury or death. Domestic homicides represent a substantial portion of fatal violence in urban environments. These incidents frequently involve family members, romantic partners, or individuals with shared living arrangements. National and local trends indicate that domestic homicides are often preceded by unresolved conflicts, verbal disputes, or patterns of instability that may not have reached the threshold for legal intervention. In cases involving siblings, domestic homicide statistics are less common but often involve shared stressors such as financial pressure, housing instability, or unresolved interpersonal issues. Family-related fatal incidents present unique investigative difficulties. The familiarity between the involved parties often means there are fewer external witnesses and a higher likelihood of conflicting accounts. Evidence collection relies heavily on physical forensics, digital records, and post-incident behavior. These cases also raise questions about access to firearms within family settings and whether safeguards or prior interventions could have altered the outcome. Law enforcement agencies often review prior police contacts, if any, to determine whether warning signs were present. When a shooting is reported within a residence, law enforcement response follows a standardized protocol. Officers secure the scene, assess immediate threats, and provide medical aid if possible. Once a fatality is confirmed, homicide detectives take control of the investigation. Evidence collection includes firearms, shell casings, electronic devices, and environmental data from the scene. Investigators also work to establish timelines through witness interviews, surveillance footage, and communication records. In family-related cases, officers are trained to separate involved individuals and preserve statements made in the immediate aftermath. Police handling of domestic disputes emphasizes de-escalation and safety assessment. However, intervention typically depends on prior reports or observable threats. In many cases, conflicts escalate without prior law enforcement involvement, limiting opportunities for preventative action. When no protective orders or documented incidents exist, police may have little historical context before a fatal event occurs. This reality underscores the difficulty of predicting violence in private settings where disputes remain undocumented. The death of Edshania Williams has been classified as a homicide, and the investigation has progressed beyond the preliminary stage. A suspect, identified as her brother, Travali Smith, has been arrested and formally charged. With an arrest made, the case has shifted from an active search for suspects to a prosecutorial phase, though investigative work continues in parallel to support the charges filed. The case is proceeding through the criminal justice system and is positioned for trial unless resolved through pretrial motions or plea negotiations. Prosecutors are preparing to present evidence establishing the sequence of events, the relationship between the parties, and the circumstances leading to the fatal shooting. The defense is expected to challenge elements of intent, evidence handling, and the interpretation of forensic findings. Pending legal actions include pretrial hearings addressing bail status, evidentiary admissibility, and procedural matters. Motions may be filed regarding the suppression of statements, the handling of physical evidence, or the inclusion of expert testimony. These legal steps will shape the scope of information presented to a jury and determine which elements of the investigation become part of the public record. Upcoming hearings are expected to address procedural timelines and readiness for trial. These hearings may include status updates from both prosecution and defense, as well as rulings on outstanding motions. Each hearing provides incremental insight into how both sides intend to argue the case and what evidence they consider most critical. Despite the arrest, certain evidence remains under review. This includes detailed forensic analysis of the firearm involved, examination of digital communications, and verification of timelines established through witness statements. Investigators continue to assess whether all physical evidence aligns with the suspect's statements and the prosecution's theory of the case. Outstanding forensic results may include final ballistics confirmation, gunshot residue analysis, and supplemental toxicology findings. These results are essential for reconstructing the incident and determining factors such as distance positioning and sequence of actions. Any discrepancies between forensic data and witness accounts could significantly affect legal arguments. One of the central unresolved questions is what occurred in the moments leading up to the discharge of the firearm. Investigators seek to determine whether the shooting followed a verbal dispute, physical altercation, or sudden escalation. Without comprehensive third-party witness accounts, this determination relies on physical evidence and statements from involved individuals. Another critical question is whether any warning signs or prior intervention opportunities existed. Investigators are examining whether there were previous conflicts, calls for service, or informal reports that indicated escalating tension. The absence of documented incidents does not eliminate the possibility that warning signs were present but unreported. Understanding why the conflict escalated to fatal violence is central to both the legal case and broader discussions about prevention. This includes examining stressors such as financial pressure, mental health concerns, substance use, or situational triggers. Determining whether the escalation was impulsive or deliberate remains a key focus. Questions also remain regarding whether all relevant evidence has been disclosed and fully analyzed. Defense and prosecution teams will scrutinize investigative completeness, including whether alternative explanations were sufficiently explored and whether all digital and physical evidence has been accounted for. What is verified is that Edshania Williams died from a gunshot wound to the head inside a residence in the South Shore neighborhood of Chicago. Her death was ruled a homicide. Her brother, Travali Smith, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and unlawful possession of a weapon. The case has moved into the judicial process, with further legal proceedings pending. Continued scrutiny is required regarding the precise sequence of events, the role of interpersonal dynamics, and the interpretation of forensic evidence. The outcome of pending analyses and court rulings will determine which facts are established beyond dispute. This case highlights ongoing issues related to firearm access, domestic conflict, and the limitations of intervention in private disputes. Accountability will ultimately be determined through the legal process. Prevention efforts depend on understanding how private conflicts escalate and identifying mechanisms that could interrupt such trajectories before they result in fatal outcomes. If you found this story as gripping and heartbreaking as we did, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. And if you want to hear more true crime stories that uncover the mysteries behind these tragic events, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss our latest stories, updates, and discussions. Thank you for joining us on this journey to seek justice and explore the truth. Together, we can make a difference. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.